Okay. Good afternoon again, everybody. My name is Rachel Keesler. I'm from the Connecticut Family Support Network, and I am a family support coordinator for the Northeast and Southeast region. I'm very excited to be here with Dr. Zara Deluca today, and she has a wonderful presentation about a topic that I think doesn't get talked about enough in our community. And I'm very excited for her to talk about this topic today. So I will hand it over to you, Sarah. Thank you so much.
I'm very excited to talk about it too. And today's talk is about supporting siblings in the context of disability. And I'll introduce myself first. I'm Zara Deluca. I am a speech therapist by trade. I'll give my little intro on the next slide. But also, you can find me on Instagram at HeySibSister. That's where I post a lot of my information. So, I'm a professor and a speech language therapist at Southern Connecticut State University. I am a Sib Shop facilitator and a founder of the founder of the Southern Connecticut Sib Shop. And Sib Shops are programs that meet to provide support to siblings of people with disabilities. So I run the Southern Connecticut Sib Shop meets every month for 2 hours, and we are designed to support siblings aged 5 to 13 who have siblings with disability. I also am the state representative for a national organization called the Sibling Leadership Network, which is a network of adult siblings of people with disabilities. And I co-lead our state's chapter called the CT Sibs, and that meets over Zoom once a month as well. It's an open space for adult siblings to come and share their experiences, advocate for different things. And then maybe my other really important role is I'm a skier and an adaptive coach with Summit Adaptive at Ski Sundown in New Hartford, Connecticut, whose program's mission is to get folks with disabilities out into our community doing outdoor recreation activities. But most importantly, my role is that I'm a sib. My own sibling has disabilities, and here is us in the most magical place on earth, which of course she loves very, very much, and we try to go there as often as we can. And this word sib is a term, usually an endearing term for the word sibling, but it's also a word that siblings of people with disabilities use to describe themselves. So when I talk about sibs, I'm referring to siblings of people with disabilities. And the first thing that I want to share is this lovely portrait that one of the sibs in my sib shop drew of their sibling, with the reminder that ableism often tints our views. So ableism being this systemic societal feelings towards disability, and often that can be negative, and it can tint our view of sibs and parents of peoples with disabilities as being a negative experience. But that isn't true. And in fact, many studies suggest the positive impacts of lived experience with disability, and that leads to the development of advocacy, adaptation, and inclusion that is needed to fight ableism. And eventually, those adaptations and advocacy and inclusive pieces of us actually outweigh many of the negative aspects. So, families where one or more children have disabilities have lots of joy. This joy is unique to our experience. That doesn't mean that we're without challenges or trauma. And those challenges and trauma are also unique to our experiences. And these joys and challenges shape who we are in really unique ways. One of the really important psychological tenets that I think about a lot is that we aren't having this experience in a vacuum. Oftentimes, psychologists talk about families and development of children as being part of linked lives, which is the idea that what happens to one of us in a family unit happens to all of us. And I think the goal of this presentation and the goal of the work I do with SIBS is that we all should be empowered to play a role in how these forces shape us. So I'm going to ask Rachel to take a pause on the recording, and I just want us all to travel a little bit down memory lane to take a moment to think about our families and the families of origin or our chosen families, and how have you seen this linked lives concept play out in your own life? How have you seen these different individual challenges or joys influence your life or impact them as a web? And I'll give you a moment to think, and then we'll all come, and I hope you'll feel comfortable sharing with us. To continue recording. Yeah. So thinking about those linked lives idea, I've thought a little bit about how disability psychologically impacts family life, and I like to categorize it into this 3 C's approach, and I've posted this on my Instagram too. I just think it neatly puts it together. So thinking about it in a broader sense, we often see disability manifest itself in families through these 3 C's. Cohesion, meaning how families bond together emotionally. Um, and oftentimes, disability will affect how families create this togetherness. So, we often see some positive pieces come out of this where there is increased empathy, increased sensitivity, and acceptance within a family unit that has disability present. There's also this really lovely flexible definition of love. In one of the research pieces that I cited down at the bottom, one of the really wonderful things where they were interviewing sisters, talking about one sister has autism and the other sister is typically developing, and the sister who is typically developing just said, well, being together is love. So we have this very flexible definition of love in our families, which again allows us to create emotional bonding and togetherness in adaptive and inclusive ways. I know that it always brings a little smile to my face to say that. And then also what is so interesting too is in the face of that ableism and this thick patina of a negative feeling about what the impacts of disability have in our lives is actually we have a shared desire for more togetherness and more inclusion. So typically when you interview families of disability in the research, they actually express a desire to keep being with each other more often. So that is actually a very positive sign of bonding to each other. And this also leads to stronger bonds with community groups and religious life as well. So it's showing us the importance of that, it taking a village, that all of us are all hands on deck when it comes to adapting to disability in our community. Another way that disability impacts family life is through coping. So we talked a little bit about those challenges that families face, and those challenges and trauma being unique to our families. So coping strategies describe how families respond to stressors to maintain and stabilize a family and family members in the unit. And I think it's no surprise to anybody in here who has disability in their family that we often have increased stressors with more feelings of anxiety, more feelings of isolation, that we're the only folks facing something. And that's, I think, the double-edged sword of that cohesion piece. The closer we are and the more tighter knit our immediate familial bonds are, I think that can reinforce that feeling of isolation. Facing stigma, lack of understanding or knowledge about our family member's disability, or even a lack of knowledge because of that disability being very flexible or changing. Impacts, which should also no surprise, impacts to sleep quantity and quality, and changes to our living space. I think oftentimes we forget that things like moving for typical folks is very, very stressful, but yet that is the reality of many families with disability. If my sister has a seizure, she may want to sleep closer to me. I've then got to figure out how can I get a space for her to sleep in this space. And now I'm doing this at 3 o'clock in the morning. My sleep quantity or quality is disrupted. And then on top of that, I'm changing around my living space too. So all of that I think is part of the ways that we cope, and those are challenges. But out of that need to cope comes an embrace of innovation, creativity, and adaptability. And I think that is who we are as a community of disability, is oftentimes a very creative one because we have no other choice. That's our pathway to survival. And the last piece of the way that disability affects our family life is through caregiving. Everyone in the family has increased responsibilities from sibs on up. So all of us are doing these things to help and accommodate our family members without any payment or reward, and we're doing these things with shifting needs daily, weekly, monthly, yearly. Of course, this caregiving takes a chunk out of our ability to experience leisure, to explore ourselves, our own likes and interests, and to get recreation time as well. This, of course, influences our view of the future and what will happen to us or what we will do in the future as well. And that's where I think a lot of we see that linked lives idea come across these 3 categories as well, with our lots being tied together as a family unit through that cohesion, through development of coping strategies, and then through a shared goal of caregiving for our family member. The way that this plays itself out through siblings oftentimes is into these different archetypes. And I think this was a really interesting article that came out by Avielli, and they really talked about how SIBs will often find themselves in one of these 5 roles. And I think that we can start to conceptualize how we want to support or help SIBs by thinking about a little bit about which archetype they fall into. So the first archetype is the third parent. I am that archetype, absolutely. I'll own up to it. But I'm the eldest daughter, no surprise. The third parent is the one who is the surrogate parent, and they are the extra person to their parent. They are the one that steps in and does the caregiving, usually out of a sense of responsibility and a sense of dedication to the family unit. We then have oftentimes a we'll also see the kind of on the opposing end is this estranged sibling, where that estranged sib feels like they were slighted or they did not get the care that they needed, and it just made them feel like they didn't fit into the family unit. They are not experiencing the positive aspects of that cohesion, and they don't maybe have those strategies to cope, or don't have access to that strategy to cope. We also see the bystander, where they are not necessarily getting involved, but they also don't necessarily feel like they are not a part of the family unit. They just aren't sure how they're supposed to interact. And they end up kind of taking a Switzerland policy when it comes to working with the person with disability in their family. And they can be very passive in what happens in the future. So maybe they are not always playing a role in thinking along with the family about what will happen to this person in the future or how they will be cared for. And that can be a very challenging piece. The mediator is often when we see parents who are struggling with connecting to their person with disabilities, their child with disabilities, and they may instead lean on the SIB to be the mediator between them and their other child. So they may rely on that sibling to mediate disagreements, challenges, other trauma that comes up. This also may happen too in families where there are multiple siblings as well. Does is I guess I can ask, and if you want to cease recording, Rachel, you can. I'm sorry, I know this wasn't one of our times that we talked about, but I'm curious spelling the myth. So yeah, I come from a family of 5, and the youngest has disabilities in my family. So I absolutely see these archetypes developing, for sure. So that mediator piece is really interesting though too, because I think that's where we talk about how parents relate to children and how siblings relate to each other. Because then what often will happen is as time goes on, we also see other siblings in that family unit might go through the mediator to connect to the sibling with disabilities too. And the last category is the friend. And this is the child that is really born into a close relationship with the person with disabilities. Oftentimes, we might see this as like when we have twins, where one of them is disabled and the other one isn't. That is a frequently occurring situation where we see this friend archetype emerge. And that is a really another powerful position because they really see the sibling with disabilities as a peer. And again, there isn't just one archetype that folks fall into. It's they can feel very much that they belong in lots of different places. But I would really love us to go into thinking about the research that I'm going to share with you guys as how can we get our siblings to really fall into the third parent and the friend and have a nice balance where they are not having feelings of parentification, where they are acting as a parent, but they're also not just relegated to that friend role. So we actually get a caregiver for life out of working with our siblings. And not only that, but a caregiver who wants to give care. I truly enjoy the days that I care for my sister. It's stressful, but it is a joy to me. It's not just an obligation, which I think falls into that third parent, but we've also developed lots of things we like to do together so I can embrace that friend archetype. And I think then too, we also think about, are there ways that we can bring meaning to the other archetypes too, so that they can contribute in the ways that they feel comfortable contributing? So we need to know more. And this is really where I do my research at Southern, as thinking about how do these C's shape the lives of parents and siblings, thinking about what is unique to the parent and the sib experience and what can be shared so that we can have better, clearer communication across a unit, and how parents and sibs are already supporting strong relationships. Because I think that it's really in that, it's the parent to sib relationship that helps to reinforce the sib to sibling relationship. And I think that once parents can model good communication, good coping strategies, ways of building that cohesion and caregiving that is transparent, that is where we can really see those sib to sibling relationships thrive. So I want to share with you guys some information from a photo voice study that I did with some sibs and parents that attend my sib shop. I gave them all pseudonyms. They siblings took pictures with instant cameras, and parents used an app called Story. And the purpose of something like Photo Voice is to take pictures, bring it into a group, show the pictures, and explain what the pictures mean to them. And I analyze those pictures then for some recurrent themes to see how are these things affecting folks, what's different, what can we do to support families. So thinking about those 3 C's, I put them all up here and then in the middle, and then you see as all these little appendages of these snowflakes are showing you some of the things that just naturally came up in these pictures and in the ways that parents and sibs talked about these pictures. In the world of coping, we really saw a lot of sibs and parents wanted a space to talk about their challenges and traumatic experiences, to vent, so that they could then develop some strategies for how they deal with those challenging experiences. So those were the 2 most common things they talked about in that realm of coping. They then also talked about caregiving, and we saw that both sibs and parents had amassed lots and lots of disability specific knowledge, which is a really powerful tool for advocacy and a really, really powerful tool for adaptation and inclusion. So we are being the change that we want to see in the world. We are adapting and creating more inclusive communities just because of the disability specific knowledge that both sibs and parents have. And then we looked at this leading to some really positive effects in cohesion, because a lot of them then ended up talking about bonding in their relationships through talking about the ways that they coped and the ways that they caregived. And then I think what's also really important here is everybody had a big sensitivity to the likes and dislikes of everybody in their family. So showing that empathy feature. So I think a big piece of this, showing all of these similarities and overlaps between parents and siblings, is really important because it shows that we all have the same things in mind as sibs and as parents. And hopefully, if we learn a little bit more about what we have in common, we figure out that we're playing on the same team. And it isn't that meme from Guardians of the Galaxy where Thor and Star-Lord are fighting over who gets to be in charge. So I want to just share a little bit about with some of the pictures and the ways that families talked about them. So I'll talk a little bit first about coping. So here's some challenges and strategies. And on the left, I've given you guys some excerpts from my sibs. And on the right, I've given you some excerpts from parents. So on the left, you see this description of challenges. I love this exchange between 2 siblings who are talking about their other sibling who has disabilities. And the first sibling talks about their sibling having a seizure in the car, and another sibling asked if they could have a fruit roll up. And the sibling responded with, "We have more problems than just a fruit roll up right now." So we see sibs in real time and making decisions and prioritizing the needs of their sibling, and coming up with some and facing some real challenges that they need spaces to talk about that. And then we see her other sibling, who is typically developing, talking about that same experience below, and just saying, well, when that happened, we were in the middle of this place in the car. We had just come back from a trip. So now the new strategy is we keep him occupied so that our sibling doesn't fall asleep in the car, leaving them susceptible to seizures. So out of this challenge, out of this traumatic thing that had happened to them, they came up with some strategies. And that strategy ended up with, I distract my sibling, I keep them awake, I do different things with them. So giving them the space to process these traumatic things that have happened to them or that they've experienced often then leads to sort of revelations of, oh, but I figured this thing out about my sibling, and here's how I can help. And I think too, also, I've shared a picture of one that one of our sibs talked about, is that their sib can't put their own socks on. It's so easy. You just got to pull it up. So I think also realizing too, that the things that they see as challenges might be something as small as this. And they want to process that too with us. And I think having safe spaces for them to vent and think about it is important. And on the right, parents wanted to talk about these things too. Parents wanted to share too. So Sarah, your sentiment about having it be difficult to challenge and challenging to travel, this was a sentiment that was shared by another parent as well. We don't do these things, these kinds of big things very often. Ooh, sorry. They tend to be overwhelming for the sibling. So this is often shared amongst other parents too. And then I had another parent send in a picture of locks on their home because they were sharing a challenge that they needed to find a way to keep their son who would figure out how to leave the house without permission. How could they keep them safe? They came up with this strategy of locking the door at night, and it worked really well for them. And I think that I love showing this side by side because the sibs in your life, they are also feeling frustrated. They are also feeling challenged. They are living through this experience with you guys as well. And I also think some vulnerability there to share that can be really powerful. They're coming up with strategies. You're coming up with strategies as parents. If you pool those strategies together, you're stronger together than you are apart. I'm sharing here too of some cohesion as well. One thing that was really lovely is seeing how the ways that they bonded, thinking about that love being so very flexible. Our sib on the left took a picture of their sibling vacuuming, and that he really loves to vacuum. And he wears headphones so he can vacuum, and she went on in this really comfortable space. All of the other sibs, I think, too, going along with that need to feel validated and to share. The other sibs in our group immediately asked, well, where does he vacuum and what does he like to vacuum? And she was so proud to tell them that he vacuums her room. And that's a way that they bond. That's a way she knows that he loves her, is that he comes and asks her to vacuum her room. So thinking about that ways that they bonded, the sibs are very keen to their siblings' likes and dislikes, and also are very interested and apt to pick up on those likes and dislikes and support them. And down below, I also shared another excerpt from a sib talking about a picture she had taken with apples, and that their sibling likes apples. And when they're done with the apples, they give it to their bunny. And that's how they show that they love them. And on the right, parents also talked about this too. So one parent talked about going to like a Chuck E. Cheese type place, and that the sibling exchanged tickets to get them something they could play with together. And then another parent submitted this picture too, showing how the siblings bond together and ways that the sib is trying to bring the sibling into their experiences and their likes and interests. And I think that is so important to share. So yet again, another similarity here. We're all keen on the part that we like each other. Sometimes we let the stress and frustration and trauma and the challenges we face break us apart, but the truth of it is these pictures show us we really enjoy spending time together, even if that means letting our sibling vacuum our room for us. And then the last piece was this really wonderful aspect of caregiving, which is that we've amassed, and we as family units, as parents and as sibs, we have so much specific knowledge about our siblings' disabilities and our child's disabilities. This is, I think as a clinician, I'm going to speak for myself in that I absolutely think this is something that is missing from our medical model. We are not asking siblings, parents, what they know, the things that they know about their sibs' care, or the things they know about their child's care that are really unique and tailored to them, that can actually change the way that those clinicians approach care. So I'm shared here this lovely picture from a parent where they were talking about their child's special interests and learning from their child that they really like to autistic people prefer this term called passions. And she went on to take a picture of one of her son's passions. And on the left, I've shared some wonderful caregiving stories from my sibs. And what I think I love here about what the sibs shared was they used the specific knowledge that they had about their siblings' disability to show some of the ways that they have adapted, the ways they interact, the ways that they engage in rec time, the ways they talk to each other. And I think that that's really, really powerful. So at the bottom, I have that picture of an emergency bag, and the sib had taken a picture of it and said, oh, here's the emergency bag. This is where the medications are. Then if we spray it up his mouth, this is how we deal with the situation. So they have this knowledge. And again, my sibs are somewhere between 5 and 13. So these are 5 and 13-year-olds who already have a wealth of knowledge about disability just from the lived experience that they have. And then I also share a pair of siblings talking about their a pair of sibs talking about their sibling. One sib's talking about her oxygen um, cannula, her nasal cannula, and he goes, "My sister needs a breathing thingy." They had taken a picture of her. I didn't include it here because it had her full face, but he says, "My sister needs a breathing thingy," and the other sib just goes, "The breathing thing is awesome." So that's it too, is that not only do they have this specific knowledge of what the item is, they may not know the exact word, but they know what the item is, they know what the item does, and they have respect and interest in it, which again leads them to have this really specific pot of knowledge that can go out and help us create more adaptive, inclusive spaces. And then the one on top is maybe one of my favorite pictures and favorite narrations of this whole project that I did with parents and sibs. One of my sibs took a picture. He asked mom to take a picture of him and his sibling, and in her hospital bed. And he told us that tall bed makes it easier for mommy and daddy to work with the sibling. It's like this big tall bed. Tall beds are fun. And also, there's this, if you go down to the right, and he's pointing, and you crawl under, there's this little nookie where you can secretly high five her. So I think then too, not only have they had found specific knowledge about disability, about the hospital bed, how does the hospital bed work? Where does it go? What goes underneath it? You raise it up and down, all these other things. But they've taken that knowledge and they've built on this other layer of how do I work with this technology? How do I work with this adaptation to build a connection with my sibling? And I think this is something, again, that we often see parents treat an item as a utility, and they maybe are not always seeing it in this more creative way that we see kids are using it all the time and sibs are using it all the time. So I love to share that little story too. So let's talk about what's unique, what's special to sibs. What I think is so interesting, the three big things that stood out to me in this research was that parents often use words like normal or typical when talking about relationships or talking about things that their child did, and none of the sibs did that. And I gave a little quote here too. So here's a quote from a parent. But oftentimes, parent comments seem to be focused on the future and what would be the outcomes of not being normal or not being typical or needing to approximate normality or typicality. Whereas sibs really were living the be here now moment. They were just in it. And this was shown too sometimes in some of the pictures that they took. I had a sibling take a picture and I was like, "What does this picture mean?" And she just goes, "It means I see my sister right now. That's what she looks like. She has a funny ear." And that was it. So I think that too, of that, just they are, since they have been imbued in it and living with it their whole lives, I think there's a not as much pressure on the sibs to approximate normality or to fit in. They just are, and they see that aspect too, and that's something we can learn from sibs. What I do think is another huge important takeaway is that sibs often tended to share more about the siblings' likes and dislikes than their own. And that showed me too, and they also acknowledge that that's a priority. Their siblings' likes or dislikes become a priority in the family, just like their siblings' specialized needs become a priority in the family. And I think that that's something that might be challenging for a lot of sibs in developing their own likes, their own identity, and creating boundaries for them too. I'm going to take a little pause here so I could take a sip of water. Questions, comments, anything that I can speak to? Is this resonating with folks? Do people experience this too in their own lives? You feel like you might take your own pictures like this too?
Does anybody want me to pause the recording so they can say anything? Everyone's just a little bit quiet
Well,
today.
I was going to share, I was thinking while you were talking about how the siblings were viewing the pictures and saying like, it is what it is, not thinking of it as a unique situation. When So my daughter with a disability has the older brother, and as she grew and developed, she got very stuck. She was impulsive, so she would always be taking toys and whatnot, right out of his hand. And I always taught him, everybody learns differently. She didn't learn that yet. She didn't learn that yet. And as he grew older, I didn't want to slap labels on on her because for fear he would look at her differently. And it actually took such effect that I had to finally tell him she has a disability. Like he didn't see it because it's his sister, it's what he's always known. Um, and to try to separate the two, like it's not her fault that she doesn't have control over her reactions and she hasn't learned certain things yet. Um, it's very interesting how when it's all you know, it does become very typical, which is, I think, a good thing.
I think it's both. Nicole, I love that. And I'm going to talk about this on this slide too. Like I think it becomes both. It's so I think that's so interesting. And a lot of my sibs report that too, of like having to be told that their sibling has a disability. But I also think that's something that as parents, when we look at that slide with the challenges and the trauma, they're both experiencing the same thing. Why not? Why don't we just talk about it together? And I say this too. My parents are approaching 60, and it's still hard. It's still hard to have those conversations where we're really talking about the things that my sister needs help with, or how her care is managed, all those things, to just be really blunt about it. But I do think too, then it's a can we can we maybe use some of that trauma bonding for good? Can we maybe use it to find out the strategies and the coping mechanisms that we are both using together, so that both of us aren't experiencing that challenge in a vacuum where one of us feels like we don't know the information, or and the other one of not knowing that your sibling has a disability, and then perhaps where the parent feels like, oh, I'm so exasperated. How come they just eat the food that I want them to eat when they're with their sib? And I think that that's always an interesting piece too. Can we use that as a space to share experiences? And so that's one of the things I talk about in encouraging those positive sibling relationship patterns. How can we encourage these positive sibling relationship patterns of a caregiving aspect and a friend aspect to form together? One of the first things I talk about is that shared experience piece. And that shared experience can be between the parent and the sibling, but I think it's also sibling to sibling as well. And I think that oftentimes, the other piece of that too is we're sort of sheltered as sibs sometimes, from learning the ways that society has created barriers for our siblings to participate, because we are not able to complete certain activities together. So I think about, like, through my work at Summit, I might be teaching a lesson where I am giving skiing instruction through adaptive means to a sibling, but what is their sib doing? Their sib's doing something different. And I think that, is there a way that maybe we can create an environment? And I frequently am giving the freebie lesson where I have the sib along with me. But can we create an environment where everybody comes along, so that there is a shared experience there, so that we can see how things might be adapted, or a communication might be adjusted, so that an experience can be inclusive for both the sib and the sibling, and then hopefully maybe the entire family. So there isn't that division of, you do this thing and you do this thing, and we're shielded in some ways from the challenges and adaptations that are necessary. Some other strategies that I think can be really helpful too is addressing triangulation that sometimes happens out of the teamwork that happens in families. Going back to that linked lives idea, triangulation is a psychological term that refers to the strengths of triangles. And when we see that all the sides are strong, we have a triangle that can support a roof or a seesaw. When one angle of our triangle is lagging, it can get or dragged out to one side, it forms that weaker angle. And this might mean that there is a difference between a connection. These angles represent relationships between people in a family. So it might be sibling, parent. mom and dad or both partners act as a unit at the top. And sometimes if we see the sibling relationship build stronger, we see that that angle getting pulled out and the top gets weaker. If we see the sibling and the parent relationship becoming really, really strong, we see that aspect getting pulled out, and that leads to some patterns of estrangement for that sib. But if we can keep all the angles strong, where we're communicating together, where we're having shared experiences together, that that triangle can stay really, really strong, and we can avoid triangulation where somebody feels estranged or bystanded or left out of that family unit. Another thing that's also interesting too is attending a little bit to birth order. I already know the dearth of memes on the internet about eldest daughters. There's a lot of things to own up with that for me. But I think it's also really interesting too, learning from other siblings in different birth order. And if you have multiple kids, you can see this more readily. Younger sibs might be able to effectively engage with their disabled sibling better than older sibs. I think that's an obvious duh, because older siblings usually get parentified or have feelings of responsibility and caregiving where they can't just engage in those shared experiences as a peer or as a friend. But I think that this is also, again, yet another way to think about that really strong triangle. How can we support sib to sib or sib to sibling relationships too? And in the 5 of us, there's number 1, and I frequently go to number 3 and number 4 for advice or ideas too. And I think that that's a strategy that my parents shared too, as well, was thinking about how do my other sibs think about this too, so that I can best interact with my sibling. I think other big things that are important to also support sibs is supporting autonomy, identity, and pro-social behaviors. So we just talked about how some siblings are not always keen on their own likes and dislikes. They know a lot about their siblings' likes and dislikes. So giving them more opportunities to explore their own likes and their dislikes as well. The other piece is pro-social behaviors. So remembering that the flip side of antagonizing and arguing with your sibling is intimacy and companionship. We argue with the people, and maybe apt for all of the big feels that folks are having today too. We argue with people because we love them. We argue with people because we want things to be different, or we want to change things, or we want to change someone's mind. We don't argue with people we have no feelings about. So I think that is also interesting too. Typically, lots of sibs report that their parents intervene, or they can't understand that, just give them the toy. But in fact, the quarreling, the arguing helps those sib and sibling build that bond and navigate conflict in a healthy way. So I think that that's really, really important that we let sibs and siblings have that moment too. So I've shared some strategies here as well. And again, I'm going to give all of these slides to Rachel, and I'm going to actually post this little infographic on my Instagram too, as a place to visit back as well. So I've given some ABC strategies for sibs and parents, because again, strengthening that parent to sib relationship can also serve to strengthen the sib to sibling relationship. So A, standing for allow time. Can we make sure that we try to maintain a routine as much as possible? We see that benefits both sibs, siblings, and parents. Making time for just the parents or other valued adults to do something together. And I think that's one of the ways that my Sib Shop program really supports, is allowing experiences with other trusted adults, safe adults. Alone time for sibs to explore their own interests, and also acknowledgement of the sib from other clinicians too. And that's something that I've been working on. The B being befriend. Can we befriend supportive spaces like Sib Shop, or like parent support groups that like CTFSN hosts? Using inclusive terminology for caregivers. Oftentimes we default to a parent as a caregiver, but in truth, caregivers are also siblings who are helping to put on socks. Engaging in advocacy. I think this is so important that sibs see you guys as advocates for for their sibling. That encourages them to continue having that agency in their experience. And of course, psychological counseling can be really helpful too. The last piece being our C, our communication. One of the things that a lot of my sibs talked about was the ways that they communicated with their parents, and that those were really positive ways that they felt about their experience and that they felt about their sibling. I took this little picture here that one of my sibs sent in about an us journal that she has with her mom. And she was saying, well, I write on one page, my mom writes on the other. We write back and forth to each other every week. We talk about my brother. We talk about how things are going in the family, my chores, other things like that. And it keeps the expectations for her clear. And she also has a really good relationship with her brother because she's being communicated all the information that she needs to know for her age at this point. And explaining the disability and its care, framing caregiving as an invitation to learn. I think that's always really important too, and yet another wonderful way that parents can practice that really good transparent communication. And I think once sibs have a really good understanding of the ways that their siblings interact, they'll be better siblings to their siblings as well. Creating opportunities to learn about the sibling from the sib too. And just as I said, I love to consult my siblings in the other birth order to get insight too. This is a great space too where parents can ask siblings and vice versa. I think it invites communication on both ends. And planning for the future together, I think being really transparent about what will happen in the future and or what we hope to happen in the future can help everybody in the linked life of a family to plan for the best outcomes for the person with disabilities. And why is this important? Here's a drawing that I drew when I was 6 at the arrival of number 4. I had to embarrass myself. I wasn't going to embarrass any of my sibs anymore. So it's me and one of my younger siblings. And I love this quote from The Sibling Effect, which is a great book by Jeffrey Kluger talking about typical sibling relationships and how they affect our lives. And I kind of want to just end on this. With Americans living longer than ever, increasing numbers of us will be launched into an old age where we've outlived our friends, our parents, and even our spouses, while our children and grandchildren have scattered to distant cities. For plenty of us, the only ones left at the end of the dance will be the ones what brung us, the brothers and sisters who have been with us the longest, loved us the hardest, and by a wide margin know us the best. I don't think I can say it any better, but I think all of these things are important, keeping that triangle really strong, building relationships, sib to parent, sib to sibling, is because it hopefully will mean that when parents are no longer there, that there is a strong, loving relationship that is built upon care and communication. That means that both of those siblings have a great life ahead of them with parents no longer present. And I think that that is also important, leaving the world better than we found it. Maybe is starts with creating loving, wonderful bonds, that people that can go out and share that love with other folks. So I know we only have about 10 more minutes, but I wanted to open it up to everybody to ask questions, and Rachel can stop recording. But here's my email, here's my Instagram, here's a picture of our lovely sib shop. So if you think that this would be of benefit to the sibs in your life, and help give you guys an inroad to better communication or a space to vent or process feelings, you're welcome to join us. Our next sib shop is actually this coming Friday at 4:30. If you have an older sibling, let's chat. I always need helpers. And I'm always looking to expand too. And then we have another sib shop coming up in December. I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and then I just want to hear from you guys, how you feelings, thoughts, anything else. And I'll ask Rachel to stop recording so you can share.